Hello, everyone, and welcome to the broadcast today. Thanks for joining us on this educational webinar as part of our series. And today we're going to be talking about health savings accounts and how powerful a tool they are and ways that you can utilize them. So thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Clay Malcolm here at Advanta IRA. Let me see if I can advance my slide. And I've been in the self-directed IRA and HSA space for over 10 years now. And I am an active self-directed IRA and HSA investor myself, so I have a lot of understanding of the processes that we go through to find investments and set them up and execute that investment paperwork, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm happy to be a resource for you today. And along those lines, please do feel free to type in questions in the questions box in your console, and happy to answer those at the end of the presentation. I'll probably take, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes or so here with some slides just to talk about some of the ways that HSAs behave and the way that we interact with them as investors. And then I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. So please do feel free to type those into the questions box at any point. You'll also see my contact information there in our website. We do want to be a resource for you, so please do feel free to reach out to me directly or visit our website, which has a good bit of information on it as well. All the information I'm going to give you today is for education purposes only. At Advanta IRA, we do not give tax, legal, or investment advice. We don't advocate any particular investment strategy or any investment vendor. We certainly encourage you to use your financial team as well as any other resource that you would like when you're doing your due diligence on a particular investment type, or doing your due diligence on Advanta IRA. And so all of the onus of due diligence and things like that actually does end up being the account holders in a self-directed IRA, or today, as we're going to talk about, HSAs. And that provides us a lot of investment freedom, but it also does encumber us, to some extent with a little bit more due diligence than we may be doing on other investment scenarios. So please do understand that as a self-directed HSA account holder, you're the one who's going to choose the investments, do the due diligence, negotiate the deals, and actually we're just going to work with you to establish the paperwork that substantiates that the investments that your HSA is making are part of the account, and so they get to keep the tax benefits that are associated with the account type. And of course, HSAs have tremendous tax advantages, which we'll talk about here in a moment. So again, just encourage you to, whether your team is a CPA, has a CPA, an attorney, financial advisor, family members, whoever that is, engage those when you're doing your due diligence on any of the investments or investment strategies that we might talk about today. All right, so let's get into HSAs and a little bit about how we can use them to our best benefit. An HSA, or health savings account, it's a tax advantaged account, and it was created in no small part to go along with high deductible health plans, which were becoming more prevalent 15 years ago or so, 20 years ago. And the idea is, if you have a high deductible health plan, that means obviously you have to pay that deductible before the health insurance starts to kick in and to reimburse you for any medical expenses. Well, that could be a burden. Generally speaking, high deductible health plans have lower premiums, so that was a good thing for the employee. But if they did start to have some health issues, then the deductible started to be a little cumbersome. And so the complementary tool that was developed to handle that high deductible was this HSA. And as I mentioned before, it has tremendous tax benefits, and I'll probably say this more than once today, but it is pre-tax money in, like a traditional IRA. So you either have it deducted from your pay, or you can take a tax deduction for it on your taxes, one or the other of those. So pre-tax money in. When it's invested, while it's in the HSA, its earnings are tax deferred, so they can compound faster, and that's the same as in a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA. And when you take a distribution of an HSA, and it's for a qualified medical expense, it corresponds to a qualified medical expense, it's tax-free on the way out. So it is literally tax-free money. And the earnings that your HSA contributions make are tax-free. So in terms of, it has the best features of both traditional IRAs and Roth IRAs. It's like having them combined. And so they are a tremendous tax tool. And I would say that, you know, as we talked about the idea of it being a tool that is used to save, to pay medical expenses, to cover a deductible, I will also say that its larger long-term benefit is that it can actually help you pay for a lifetime's medical expenses. And, you know, estimates these days of any average individual's medical expenses over their lifetime is, you know, several $100,000. And so it's really a tool that can help both in the short term and the long term, and that's a theme that we'll keep coming back to. You'll see here on the screen that I wanted to pay particular attention to the fact that HSAs are not to be confused with flex spending accounts, or an FSA, or health reimbursement accounts, which is an HRA. And the big features that HSA has that are different is an FSA is use it or lose it, right? So you set aside some money and you use it for medical expenses in a year. And if you don't use it, notwithstanding the fact that you have a little bit of a grace period at the end, you actually can lose that money. HSAs are not like that. Once you make a contribution to an HSA, it is in that account until such time as you take distribution of everything that's in the account. So it stays in effect through time, and you're the one managing it. Health reimbursement accounts, of course, are managed by your employer. So again, if you change employers or things like that, then your HSA benefits go away. In contrast, HSAs are portable, meaning that once you establish one, if you change employers or even health plans, as long as it's still high deductible, well, let's go back. If you change health plans, the HSA stays in force. It stays in existence until, again, such time as you've taken all the distributions. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit more. If you change health plans and you go from a high deductible health plan to a non-high deductible health plan, then you can no longer make contributions to the HSA. But it does not mean that the HSA ceases to exist. So I want to make that clear as well. So HSAs have a number of unusual features, and it's really interesting. I used to teach a class to CPAs about HSAs and things like that, and the gates, the swinging gates, so to speak, what allows you to do what thing, like make a contribution or take a distribution or move money from one HSA to another. Those types of things, they're not all incredibly intuitive. And so today we're going to outline all of the major gates or restrictions or rules that are important to be thought about when you're thinking about a strategy. But it's not all probably going to be super intuitive. So, you know, please do feel free to use us as a long-term resource. The idea of today's presentation is to give you a sense of how you might be able to use this account for your long-term investment and your long-term financial benefit. Another thing that I like to stress about HSAs is that HSAs are an individual custodial account. And that's why here at Advanta, of course, we have IRA in our name, Advanta IRA. And that's because we specialize in self-directed IRAs. In other words, IRAs that can invest in alternative assets. Well, the reason that is important is because traditional and Roth IRAs that we handle are individual custodial accounts. That's why they're mobile. That's why you can have that through time, no matter if you change employers or anything happens in your life, you're able to maintain that IRA and take it with you and continue to contribute to it and contribute to save for your retirement. HSAs have that same setup, and that's why we handle them, because they are the bookkeeping and the administration and the custodial duties are almost exactly the same as they are for traditional IRA or Roth IRA. And of course, our HSAs can invest in alternatives just like our IRAs can. But if you know anything about self-directed IRA rules, this is going to be more familiar to you than you might imagine, because the rules for HSA investing are very similar to the ones that are in force for self-directed IRAs. In other words, there's disqualified persons, prohibited transactions. We'll touch on those a little bit. But the idea is that this tax-advantaged account, when it has money in it, can go out and invest in all kinds of alternative assets. And because it is an individual custodial account, you control it. Your insurance company does not control it, even though you have to have a high deductible health plan in order to establish an HSA and contribute to one. So the insurance company is involved on that level, but the insurance company does not control the money once it's been contributed to the HSA. It is under you, the account holder's control. It is also not controlled by your employer. No matter what they tell you, no matter what the insurance company or your employer tells you about maybe that they're in control of your HSA, they are not. It is a federal account type, and you as the account holder are in charge of it. Now, the employer can have a lot of interaction with your HSA, meaning that a lot of them will contribute to your HSA for you. That's a great benefit from employers. Sometimes the employer will help you set up the HSA. Sometimes the insurance company will as well. But that doesn't mean that the money that goes into it is controlled by them. That means that they have helped you set up an HSA at a particular custodian. But as we'll talk about later, you can move that money from one HSA to another at your discretion anytime you want. As soon as it becomes an official contribution and lands in an HSA, you can move it to any other HSA that you want. And the reason that you might do that, of course, is for investment purposes, and we'll talk about that strategy as we move down the line. Now, your employer could say to you, hey, we will contribute to your HSA as long as you have it at such and such a custodian, maybe a local bank or something like that. And so from an employee / account holder perspective, it seems like a great idea to say, yes, I would like to establish an HSA at the custodian that you have chosen, because that is then going to trigger your contributions to that HSA. And I want that money, right? It's free money. And it's money that you get, but is not added to your income, right? So it can be a great benefit. The employer may have a lot to do with where it gets set up initially and things like that. But that, again, does not mean that they are in control of it. Once money has been contributed to the HSA, you are in control of where it goes from that point. So again, the insurance company and the employer can have a lot to do with the setup and possibly the contributions and things like that, but that does not mean that they're in control of it. You are. Okay, so I mentioned the fact that HSAs are a great tax tool, but not everybody qualifies for them, right? So you need to have meet certain requirements in order to open an HSA and to contribute to an HSA. And first and foremost of those is have a high deductible health plan. High deductible health plans are defined, generally speaking, as plans that have a deductible amount which is at least at a certain threshold level. And you can see those threshold levels there: $1,400 for individual coverage and $2,800 for family coverage. They are also characterized by having an out-of-pocket maximum. And for self-only coverage, you'll see there it's $7,000 in 2021, $7,050 in 2022. Family coverage, you can see there $14,000, and then in 2022, $14,100. Those are the in-plan out-of-pocket maximums. So the health plan, the health coverage, the insurance that you get has to have a deductible in between those amounts for it to qualify as a health plan that allows you to qualify for an HSA. You also can't have other health coverage, general health coverage. You can't have vision and dental, workers' compensation is allowed. There are certain, hospitalization coverage and things like that that are also allowable, but no other general healthcare coverage. In other words, you can't mitigate the deductible by having a second generalized healthcare plan. The only way that this becomes a qualification for you to have an HSA is if it is your primary and only generalized health insurance. And we'll talk about some of the exceptions that you can have for within the HDHP that still makes that plan a qualifying plan. So you can see some of them there. And one of the things that is, I think, a good thing to highlight is that a high deductible health plan may have a very high deductible. That does not mean that preventative care is excluded. Preventative care is a feature of an HDHP that doesn't make the HSA disallowed. So you can have annual physicals, prenatal care, well child immunizations. There are certain screenings. So there are some things that are just kind of smart healthcare items that can be covered by first dollar insurance coverage, and that plan is still considered to be a high deductible health plan. So, and all these things are things that, again, usually if you're getting the coverage through through an employer, usually your HR person will be able to help you with this, or the insurance person for that company. If you're going through a broker or something like that, they will also usually be able to help you with plans that qualify as high deductible for HSA purposes and one that might not. The other thing that I'm going to highlight for you while we're talking about this, because we're going to start to get into the rules here, is IRS publication 969 is really helpful when it comes to HSAs. It also covers flex spending accounts and HRAs. So it's a great publication. I know that people think the IRS site is always, kind of going to be impenetrable and that kind of thing. But the publication 969 is a really helpful tool. So please do, go to the IRS website and download that if you want more information, and if you just want to have it as reference because it has all these numbers in it and things like that. Okay, so back to requirements for having an HSA. You have to have a high deductible health plan. You can't be enrolled in Medicare, and you can't be claimed as somebody's dependent, or in certain circumstances even be eligible to be claimed as somebody's dependent. So usually the shorthand of this is you have to have an HDHP, you can't be in Medicare, and you can't be somebody's dependent. So those are the things that qualify you to make contributions to an HSA, and because you can contribute, then obviously you can establish one. All right. The benefits of HSAs. I mentioned the fact that they're, in no small part, healthcare has been changing a lot over the last several decades, and one of the rise of the high deductible health plan, again, because it had lower insurance premiums, was something that employers started to choose more, at least to offer their employees, and then the employees were, again, kind of struggling with how do we handle that high deductible, and so that's part of the way that HSAs evolved and became such a much more ubiquitous tax tool and account type than it used to be. And I would also say that there was a lot of rhetoric at the beginning, and HSA started in 2003, I believe, about if you have a high deductible health plan and you as the consumer are actually choosing your healthcare providers and the services that you want, that you will be a more discriminating consumer. And so that because of that consumer driven desire to pay less, you will actually help to reform the healthcare system by not using services that are more expensive than they need to be, so on and so forth. Again, this was the theory. The outcome of that I have no statistical knowledge of, but it is a little bit of the background of what was going on with HSAs and how they ended up coming into vogue here. I've mentioned pretty much all of these characteristics as I've gone through the first several slides, so I'm not going to stay on this a whole lot longer. But the idea again is to be able to, again, deal with that high deductible health plan, but I want to add as I always do, that it does have some long-term ramifications because it's not a use it or lose it account type. So it can have really powerful long-term investment effects as well. So we'll talk about those. And this is, you can see down there toward the bottom, it does talk about the tax benefits again, and I will reiterate, it's pre-tax money in, it's tax deferred while that money is in there earning, hopefully. It doesn't have to be invested, but while it's in the account, there's no tax on it. And if you take a distribution for a qualified medical expense, it is tax-free. So that entire sequence of events can be tax-free. And if you are able to, and you can keep that money in the HSA and invested and earning more, those earnings can still be distributed for qualified medical expenses tax-free. So really, the tax benefits of this account type are remarkable. Okay. There are two quote-unquote types of HSA accounts. That's not actually, an HSA is one account type, so that's why I put the types in quotation marks there. But you will have custodians that will ask you what type you want, and what they're really talking about is the contribution level. And what that is really being asked, the underneath question there is actually kind of what type of health coverage you have. So HDHPs come in two different varieties here. One is for where only an individual is covered. So that's individual HSA or solo. There's other names for it. So if that insurance, the health plan, the healthcare coverage is only covering one person, then that's an individual HSA, so to speak. And what that means is that you can only contribute up to the amount allowed for an individually covered person who has an HDHP. And then family HSA means an individual plus at least one other family member. It can be multiple other family members that are covered under the HDHP, but it has to be at least two, the individual and at least one other family member. So spouse, kids, that kind of thing. So those are the two things that you'll be hearing as maybe types of HSAs. Again, there's only one type of HSA, but the contribution amounts are determined by the healthcare coverage that you have, and that's really a function of the HDHP and who is covered underneath it. And I mentioned the fact that that HDHP coverage, whether it's for one person or more than one person, triggers some rules. Well, one of the big rules is contribution limits, right? So contribution limits are a little bit different in 2021 and 2022, so I put them both on there. If you have self or individual coverage, that's $3,600 in 2021. It went up by $50 in 2022, and I will tell you that trend of contribution limits going up, and to some extent the deductible amounts have inched up in certain years as well. And I guess I only say this because it's actually important for you to check these rules annually, because they move enough that they will change from year to year. And then you can see the family coverage is $7,200 for 2021 and $7,300 for 2022. The catch-up provision did not move. What that means is that if you are age 55 and older, then you actually can contribute an additional $1,000. And since we're talking about contributions, and we're going to talk about them more in the next slide, so why don't I just go to that? But understand that. So while we're on this, HSA for individual or self coverage in 2022, the annual contribution limit is $3,650 unless you are 55 or older, in which case it would be $4,650. If you have family coverage, and let's say it's you and your spouse, and you both can have HSAs, and if you're both over 55, you would each get $1,000 of catch-up. So it could be as much in that particular scenario as $9,300 that are contributed in tax year 2022. So understand that you do have a makeup or catch-up contribution provision at 55. Now remember, IRA catch-up provisions and 401k catch-up provisions start at age 50. So the catch-up provision threshold age is higher for HSAs. So I mentioned the fact that, well, let's talk about contributions to HSA. So contributions must be made in cash. They can be made by anybody, and unlike traditional IRAs and Roth IRAs and 401ks and these other kind of account types that we also handle, there's no earned income requirement for health savings accounts. And there is no interaction between health savings account contributions and IRA contributions, right? So you all might know that, at certain point, if you have multiple accounts like a 401k and a traditional IRA and maybe have others as well, at some point the IRS is going to stop. They have an annual deductible limit, and there are certain restrictions on when you can contribute and that kind of thing. All of them are based on, you have to have earned income and things like that. So there's rules about it, and if you have multiple accounts, they might interact with one another and limit your ability to contribute one or the other. Please consult your tax professional. I am not a CPA. I'm not giving you tax advice, and all of that has to do with the particular circumstance that you have going financially. That said, if your goal and your ability allow for you to make contributions to multiple tax advantaged accounts, your HSA contribution limit and amount does not have any interaction with your IRA and 401k contributions. So it is more money that you can put into tax advantaged accounts. All right. Now, I made the point that your employer can make contributions for you, and that does not end up being considered to be income for you. So that's a great deal. And the employer, of course, gets to take the deduction, but any contributions that you make as the account holder are pre-tax. So that either means that in a cafeteria style plan, it was deducted from your pay, or if you're going to make your contributions after the fact, you get to take a tax deduction for the contributions that you make. And anybody, and this is one of the things that blows my mind about HSAs. The IRS will let anybody make your HSA contributions, and if you can get a friend or a family member to make your HSA contributions, you actually get the tax deduction for them. They don't. So it's an interesting thing, and maybe you guys will start working on your friends and family members about making your HSA contributions if you can swing that. So it really is. It's got some remarkable features to it. And yes, and contributions can be made up until your tax filing date, or well, I shouldn't say that. It's up till tax day. So your contributions, we're in that unusual time of year where you can make contributions to your HSA as well as some of your IRAs and things like that for tax year 2021 and 2022 at this moment. Right? So you have the ability to make contributions to both. All right, I'm rambling on. All right, so I'm going to be a little longer than I thought I would, but we're gonna venture forth. Okay, a couple of special rules. I'm not quite sure why the S on the special rules is a little S, but no, that's not intended to mean anything. There's a couple of special rules about HSA contributions. So one I'm going to mention is this. One of the first criteria for whether you can make a contribution to an HSA, and usually it's sometimes that is your initial contributions, which means you're establishing the HSA. If you are covered by an HDHP for at least one full month in a given year, let's say 2021, and let's say that month is December, you are actually allowed to contribute for the entire year for 2021, as long as you maintain high deductible healthcare coverage for the subsequent 12 months. In other words, the entirety of 2022. So that's a huge benefit, right? Because most of the time, and in other circumstances, you can only make a pro rata share of contributions to your HSA for the months that you were covered by an HDHP. So instead of, in that scenario that we talked about, instead of in 2021, your contribution being 1/12 of the annual contribution limit, the IRS is going to allow you to contribute for the entire year, so long as you meet the the 12 full months after the fact. So that's a very nice feature. And again, it's intended to, especially for people who are establishing HSAs for the first time, to be able to get some money in there so that if there is a healthcare need that you have, that you'll have money set aside to handle the deductible. So understand that for the first year, you actually get a kind of a benefit as long as you maintain the qualifying period after the fact, which is 12 full months after that. Second getting started thing that can be very powerful is that you are allowed to take a one-time movement of funds from your traditional or Roth IRA into your HSA. Now, it's not an unlimited amount of money. You can only use that tool, well, once in a lifetime, and it has to be only up to the annual contribution limit minus any other contributions that you made, right? So you can't use this tool to over contribute to your HSA. But it is a way, if you don't have a lump sum that you want to be able to make contribution to your HSA, so that you have that, again, that critical mass of cash to handle a possible medical emergency where you need to cover a high deductible. You can get your HSA started by moving funds from your IRA, and you get to do it once in a lifetime. The movement's not taxed or penalized. I did this myself, so I know that it can happen. It is a movement from one custodian to another, so the movement of funds is from an IRA custodian directly to the HSA custodian. So in that way, it's actually kind of a transfer, but it's not taxed, it's not penalized, and again, it is a getting started tool that can be very effective for you. And it doesn't have to be when you're getting started, by the way, but it is a tool that is available for you. Okay, another couple of rules that are important. So we talked about how you qualify for an HSA and its tax advantages and making contributions, so getting money into the HSA. So now let's talk about distributions and investments. So what's going to happen with that money while it's in there? And first and foremost, I'm going to say something about the qualified medical expenses, because this is one of the interactions that you're going to have with your HSA, which is paying for medical expenses, right? Whether it's now or in the future. And a key gate that we talked about at the beginning is that qualified medical expenses can only occur after the HSA has been established. So once you qualify to create an HSA, in other words, contribute to one, it may be a good strategy to go ahead and do that, even if you only make $5 in contribution, because later you might be able to make more contributions. And the reason that that's important is because qualified medical expenses that occur prior to the time that the HSA is established for the first time will not be reimbursable tax-free. The HSA has to be in existence, and then the qualified medical expense occurs for there to be tax-free distribution to cover it. So getting the HSA open is an important factor, making your first contribution so that you have the HSA open. Once it's been established, then any qualified medical expense after the fact, after that date, is eligible to be reimbursed tax-free. So understand that the HSA establishment date is important for that factor. And I talked about the fact that tax-free distributions are tied to them corresponding, that amount, the distribution corresponding to qualified medical expenses. Some people say, well, shoot, I'm not sure I want to contribute to an HSA, because what if I don't have any qualified medical expenses? Well, the thing I will tell you about qualified medical expenses is it is a huge set of stuff. So not only is it the medical expenses that you might think of, I'm having surgery or I had a health emergency and that kind of thing, but so I need to pay the deductible for that before the health insurance kicks in. But it also takes care of things like dental and vision, chiropractors. As long as it's prescribed by a doctor, almost all things are eligible in here. First aid things, the boot that you have to have if you sprain your ankle, capital improvements to home with the main purpose of medical care. Long-term care insurance, in some cases, the premiums can be qualified medical expenses. So any of the expenses that you might occur that you'll find on, when you do your Schedule A on your taxes. So the IRS's description of medical expenses, but also dental, vision, and other things, right? So it's a gigantic set of stuff that will allow you to correspond that distribution that you take for this medical expense, right? And when we're talking about these qualified medical expense, one of the dynamics that I'll mention right now is that you can reimburse yourself from your HSA for a qualified medical expense, either at the time of service, and that's usually accomplished by giving them your HSA's debit card or something like that, or you can do it after the fact. In other words, you pay the medical expense at the doctor or the pharmacy out of pocket, and then you go to your HSA provider and say, hey, can you send me a check for $150 because I incurred this qualified medical expense. They send you the check. Because it corresponds to a qualified medical expense, it's not taxed. There's no age requirement, by the way, either. So we talked about the comparison with HSAs and IRAs. There's no 59.5 line here. So once you've made contributions to your HSA, you can take a distribution for a qualified medical expense the next day. And frankly, that can be very powerful. And I'll explain why in a moment here. But there's no age thing for qualified medical expense distributions, right? Okay. So there are all kinds of ways. I've heard lots of questions about medical travel and things like that. So yes, those are can be qualified medical expenses. So there's lots of ways to activate or take a distribution that is tax-free, because the set of stuff that is qualified medical expenses is so big. There are non-qualified medical expenses, so I mean, just understand that they exist. So non-prescription drugs. Several years ago, over-the-counter drugs were considered to be qualified medical expenses, but that's not the case anymore. Cosmetic surgery, babysitting, things like this. So you see them on the screen there. So, and sometimes there's some discussion about whether it's a qualified medical expense or not. And generally, I will say that if you can get a doctor to prescribe it, you have a very good case to make that it is a qualified medical expense. But it's not everything. So it's a big set of stuff, but it's not everything. Okay, record keeping for these expenses, and this is why it's very important. The IRS would like for you to keep the receipts and keep records of when you took distribution from your HSA for qualified medical expenses, because it needs to correspond to a qualified medical expense in order for it to be tax-free. If you take a distribution, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, but if you take a distribution for a non-qualified medical expense before age 65, not only is it taxed, there's also a 20% penalty. So understand that there's some ramifications for trying to get HSA money out without having it correspond to a qualified medical expense. But you can take that distribution for a qualified medical expense either at the time of service or any time after that. So you can hold on to those receipts knowing that they are reimbursable, tax-free at any point. You can keep the money in the HSA, and it can be growing. The HSA can be growing not only by additional contributions, but also by investment returns. That's the long-term benefit of what an HSA can do. Anyway, keep track of what your qualified medical expenses are. Some HSA providers are more helpful with that than others, but all HSA custodians have some record-keeping services attached to their service. So utilize those, but definitely, especially if you're going to hold on to receipts for the long run, hold on to them. You can scan them. They can be electronic. When you take distributions in a given tax year, that does not mean that the IRS wants you to send in those receipts with your 1040. They don't, so don't do that. But you you do need to keep record of them, and especially, I mean, my goodness, if you ever get audited, you want to be able to establish the track there. Okay, I mentioned the fact that HSA distributions are tax-free regardless of age, as long as it's for a qualified medical expense, and qualified medical expenses extend to your spouse and dependents as well. So it's that big set of stuff, but not only for you, but also for your spouse and your dependents. Now, you can't double dip and then have your spouse or your dependent take some Schedule A deduction and that kind of thing. There's no double dipping on this, but again, the idea is that it's, unless you lead a very charmed life, and I hope that for all of us, you're probably going to have something that you can call a qualified medical expense that you can so that you can take a tax-free distribution at some point in your lifetime. I will also mention the fact that at age 65, you can start taking penalty-free distributions from your HSA, so the 20% penalty goes away. If you take those distributions for something that's not a qualified medical expense and you're over 65, it's just like a traditional IRA. So you get to take the distribution, there's no penalty, but you are taxed for it. So that's a financial call that you can make at that time. And you can take tax-free distributions anytime from the date of the qualified medical expense, and that is, and the HSA has to be open, up until 1 year after your death. Of course, after your death, it's not very helpful to you, but whoever is your beneficiary can actually redeem any outstanding receipts or medical expenses that you incurred prior to your death from the HSA, and those are tax-free as well. So I've actually seen, and I know somebody who has this strategy, the HSA is actually going to be part of their generational wealth scheme. So they are paying all their medical expenses because they can, and this is a very lucky person, of course. They can pay all their medical expenses out of pocket. They're saving the receipts. They are growing their health savings account via investment, and the beneficiary is going to be the beneficiary of the HSA, because what's going to happen is they're going to be able to take all those receipts and redeem those for tax-free distribution up until a year after the death. So you have to redeem them before a year after the death. Now, if there's more money in the HSA than correspond to the qualified medical expenses, then that's taxable, but the beneficiary still gets it. And if you're a spouse, then you can take the HSA as your own. We'll talk about that more here in a moment. I jumped the gun on that a little bit, but do understand that the time frame for taking distribution for qualified medical expenses is a large one. So here we go. I was ahead of myself on this. If the primary beneficiary and 100% beneficiary of the HSA is a spouse, the spouse can basically take that HSA on as their own. For non-spouse beneficiaries, you have up until 1 year to take distribution, and if you have corresponding medical receipts, those are tax-free. Anything that's left over would be taxable. If the HSA names their estate the beneficiary, then that starts to go into the probate process, but the medical expenses can still be deducted there. Okay. So, but it does, because it's in probate, because it's part of the estate, it does end up being on the final income tax return. Now, if the strategy is, or part of the strategy is for you to make contributions to your HSA and to some extent either not have qualified medical expenses or pay for those qualified medical expenses out of your pocket so that you can have tax-free investment growth, the next question is, what can you invest your HSA in? And the answer is anything you can invest your self-directed IRA in. You can invest your self-directed HSA in. And that includes a lot of stuff. The only thing that's really excluded is life insurance and collectibles. So our HSAs at Advanta, our account holders, invest in all kinds of things. Real estate, multifamily syndication has been a subset of real estate investment that's been more popular lately. Private lending, that can be either originating notes or buying existing notes. Those can be whole or fractional. I will just tell you that my HSA is just about to participate in a loan. I'm buying a fractional piece of an existing loan. And so the HSA is going to benefit by the principal and interest payments that are made back to my HSA. So that's how I'm making one of those investments. So cryptocurrency, and I'm going to come back and spend a little bit more time on this in a moment, but that's become more popular as well. Private companies, so any kind of private placement, privately owned companies, et cetera, and precious metals, gold, silver, platinum, and palladium. All those are acceptable investments for your HSA. And I will say that, you know, we will talk about this in a moment, but one of the things that is, well, let me give you the things that can't be invested in first. Okay, so these are basically self-directed IRA rules that are, so they apply to the HSA as well. So life insurance and collectibles are not allowed as asset possibilities. There is a set of disqualified persons, just like there are for IRAs. That's the account holder and their spouse, lineal ascendants and descendants, and the descendant spouses. So account holder, spouse, parents, grandparents, kids, grandkids, kids and grandkids as spouses. Those people have some restriction in the way that they interact with your HSA's money while you are alive. So I want to specify that because you can name any of those disqualified persons as the beneficiary. That's a different operation. The disqualified person thing refers to those people interacting with your HSA's investment activity while you're alive. So there are some restrictions for those people, so just like there are for IRAs, so be aware of that. And let me go, yeah, and so let me talk about a couple things. I'm actually going to take the lower box first. So if you go back to the slide that we have with the icons, a lot of people say, well, Clay, how can my HSA invest in real estate, let's say, physical real estate? Because they're, you know, physical real estate's very expensive. I've been contributing to my HSA, but it only has, you know, $10, $20, $30, $40,000 in it. Now, there are definitely some HSAs that have way more money in it than that. I've actually seen, you know, many six-figure HSAs, and I'm sure that there are actually $1 million HSAs at this point. That said, most of us have a lot less cash than that. So you might be thinking about asset classes or investment products that have a lower cash threshold to get into. So loans is one that's particularly, you know, just has a lot of entry points. So again, whether you're originating a loan or buying an existing loan, they often have different investment amounts. And cryptocurrency, and I would also like to add, you know, precious metals there. Cryptocurrency and precious metals, because they come in very small increments, those are investments that you can make with a low cash threshold. So if you only have a few $1,000s in your HSA, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be investing it. And I'll be perfectly candid about this. Stocks and mutual funds and things like that also have a low cash threshold. So if you have your HSA at a bank or brokerage house and they offer investments, that may be a nice low threshold investment to get into. So that said, and I'm going to go back to cryptocurrency real quickly, just because we've put a lot of effort into offering cryptocurrency investment at a low price for IRAs and HSAs that have lower cash value in them. We have the LLC option that you can use to invest in cryptocurrency, and we have direct options which do not require an LLC in the middle to invest in cryptocurrency. So do ask us about that, as well as any of these other types of asset classes, because they are all available. And I'll mention before I move to the providers thing, you know, going back to the real estate comment, sometimes, and something that we're seeing more often now is somebody who has a self-directed IRA, whether it's a traditional or Roth or a SEP or a simple or any of that, even so with 401ks, and they're going to make a real estate investment. Sometimes now they are also partnering with their HSA alongside as tenants in common on that investment. So sometimes it's 95% owned by their traditional IRA and 5% owned by their HSA. But the HSA still gets to participate in the earnings that are created by the real estate investment. So do understand that there's partnership possibilities for your HSA, even if it has a lower cash value at the moment. Now let's go to the top box. Remember that HSA custodians decide what services they offer. So some of them have debit cards, some of them don't. At Advanta IRA, we do not. We are not very liquid. We're really here for investment. And conversely, not all HSA custodians offer investments. So if you have your HSA and it's at a custodian that does not offer investments and you're starting to build up some cash in there, think about making a transfer to an HSA where you can invest it, whether that investment possibility is stocks or mutual funds or publicly traded securities, or whether it is alternative assets like we handle at Advanta IRA. So because you are in control, no matter what anybody tells you, your HSA is an individual custodial account, and if you have some money in there and you want to move it to a different HSA provider, you can. You can have multiple HSAs going at any point, and that brings me to my next slide. You can have multiple HSAs for any number of reasons. You can just because you want to is one reason. If you have an HSA that's established by your employer, or maybe your insurance company or somebody else, and they're contributing, the employer, in this case the employer is contributing to your HSA, but they'll only make those contributions if the HSA is at such and such custodian. You can have them make those contributions and then frankly transfer it out the next day if you want to. Transfers between your HSAs are not taxed, they're not penalized. And if they are done so as a transfer rather than a rollover, you can also do rollovers. But if you do so as a custodian to custodian transfer, it's not even reported to the IRS. So it's not a taxable, it's not penalized. Now, the fact that you can have multiple HSAs operating simultaneously can be important from a logistical standpoint because of those offering and services that I mentioned earlier. So HSAs, some HSA custodians have very nice immediate services, short-term services. So your IRA, your HSA is in cash, which means it's very liquid. They have a debit card, so you can pay for medical expenses on the spot if you need to. And that's a short-term need and a short-term benefit. And I'm going to just say this because it's just remarkable to me. There is no holding time for your HSA contributions. You can literally make a contribution to your HSA on Tuesday, go to the doctor on Wednesday, and as long as the funds have settled in the HSA, you can take your debit card and pay for a medical expense the next day. And why would you do that? Well, because that means that that medical expense, you just saved the percentage on that bill that corresponds to whatever your income tax rate is, because you're never going to pay income tax on that money. It's pre-tax money in and tax-free on the way out. Even if you never invest it or any of that kind of stuff, you are always going to be saving on your bills when you reimburse them the percentage that is your income tax rate, because you went to the trouble of contributing it to your HSA first and then paying the medical expense or reimbursing yourself for the medical expense afterward. So some people will say, well, shoot, if I'm not ever going to be able to save anything in my HSA, I shouldn't open one. Well, that's not that's not taking into account this short-term benefit. If you can make the contribution in the HSA and then take the money out of the HSA, you get that tax percentage benefit. So very important. And if that's the only thing you use your HSA for, you are doing a great job. Good on you. Now, if you have the ability and your life works out this way, your health is good, or you have the money or the ability to do this, having a second HSA where lots of people will keep a critical mass of cash in their liquid HSA just in case they have a medical emergency or they need the money. Whatever that threshold is for you, whether it's $100 or 1 year's deductible or 2 years deductible or half a year's deductible, whatever your threshold is, you may create that threshold, and then money that you make contribution as a contribution that's over and above that. Maybe you want to move that to an HSA where you can make investments so that money can be making money, which can pay for and reimburse yourself for even more qualified medical expenses. So this is really where Advanta comes in. It's very common for us to have people who have HSA at a bank or brokerage house, and also have one with us, and they'll move over their funds to invest in those alternative assets that we talked about. So it's a great way for you to be able to, this 2 HSA model can be a great way for you to have both the convenience of the liquidity and also the long-term benefits of investment. So do keep in mind that some of the investments, and it will depend on the investments that you make with us, they're less liquid. So you can still take distribution from your Advanta HSA, no question about it. But if it's invested in real estate, if your HSA is invested in real estate, there's going to be a little bit of a process of liquidation and that kind of thing. So from a time perspective, it's less liquid. So do understand that. But I hope that that's given you a good idea of the power of HSAs, the way it can be set up, and some of the rules that are the gates that allow you to do certain things like make contributions, take distributions, and that kind of thing. I'm going to just specify, of course, that we, like I did at the beginning, we would love to be an ongoing resource of information for you. We do events like this. We have a video library both on the website and on our YouTube channel. And it has to do with account types like this, and there's also webinars about particular investment or asset classes, so you can get a lot of information from the video library. We do have a blog that comes out on the website, and it talks about a lot of current events, so new legislation and things like that, so you can look for that as well. We also have an event every other week. It's a live Zoom networking event, so for those of you who are looking for investments, or if your IRA or HSA has an investment that it wants to sell, you can come to Pitch, Promote, and Prosper. It's free, there's no obligation, and the event is basically a haves and wants, so everybody gets to introduce themselves, say what they're either looking for or what they have, and you make connections with other like-minded people. We can't and don't put together people, our account holders with investments. So it's just not something we do. We're a neutral part of the equation, but we do provide a forum where you might be able to meet somebody that would result in a transaction. And remember that starting your HSA is a relatively easy process. So it's the same application as we use for IRAs, takes about 15 minutes. Whether you make contributions or move money from another HSA, that says current IRA, which of course you can do. Oh, this is a bad slide, because you actually can't do rollovers from your 401k or 403b versus your savings plan or 457. So I apologize for that. The money would come from either another HSA or it would be a contribution, or you might activate that one-time movement of funds from your IRA. Once the cash is in your HSA, then you're ready to invest. You choose those investments, negotiate the deals, and we help you to substantiate it so you get to keep the tax benefits. So it's not a difficult process, and please do hit us up to help you get started. All right, so I went the full hour. I didn't really mean to, but I do get kind of amped up about HSAs. I think they're a great tool. This is my contact information. I'm happy to answer your questions either now or in the future. So please do feel free to type questions in the questions box, which I'm going to look at here now. And also take down my contact information and reach out if you have any questions about what we talked about today, or self-directed IRAs or things like that. All right, so questions, here we go. Good question. It's about inheritance of an HSA if you're the beneficiary. I think I went over this after the question was written in. Spouses can take the HSA over as their own. Non-spouses have a year, and the medical expenses, you have to redeem those within a year if you're a non-spouse beneficiary. Are HDAPs available on the ACA healthcare exchange? Yes, I believe they are. So the question is, the ACA healthcare exchange, can you find a high deductible health plan there? And my understanding is that the answer is yes. What are the rules around when long-term care premiums can qualify for HSA distributions? Yeah, so frankly, most long-term care insurance premiums are allowable as a qualified medical expense. And I'm going to refer you to publication 969. But generally speaking, I guess the only reason I hesitate to not say that they just are is because the long-term care insurance, there's variability in almost all kinds of insurance. So I'm a little bit hesitant to say all long-term care insurance premiums are going to be qualified medical expenses, but the vast majority of them are. Can we get a copy of the webinar handout? If that means the slides, absolutely. There's actually an email that's going to come out. It's a auto-generated email. It's going to give you a link to the recording of this event, and you can also just shoot me an email and say, hey, I want this a PDF of the slides, and I'll send them to you. Can I use HSA dollars to pay for Medicare Part B and or D? Great question. I don't know the answer. My Medicare knowledge is a little bit lacking, so I'm going to defer because I just don't know. Will the slide deck be available? Yes. Fees for HSAs. Yes. So the fees for our HSAs are the same as they are for our IRAs. That's because they're actually, we do the bookkeeping exactly the same as we do for our IRAs. So it's $50 to open the account. There's a transaction fee when you buy or sell an asset. That's usually $95. Physical real estate's a little lot higher. Precious metals is a little lower. And then there's an annual fee for the ongoing bookkeeping and the annual reporting and things like that. So it's the same fee schedule as we use for our self-directed IRAs. Okay, I see that looks like all the questions for now, although if you're typing, please do feel free to type. I'm happy to answer those as well. And for those of you who are, have questions that pop up after the fact, again, take down my contact information and just shoot those over to me whenever you have the time to write down the question and send it in. Thank you everybody for joining me today. I really appreciate you spending some time. I hope that this was helpful in terms of you understanding the rules, the power of HSAs, how you might want to utilize that account type. And again, we'd love to be a long-term resource for you, so please do reach out to us for further information. Have a great day, everybody. Be safe, be happy, and happy investing.